Welcome, folks, to our third installment of our Introduction to the Bible. A lot of it's going to be dealing with the Hebrew Bible or Old Testament. We'll talk a little bit about the difference between that this evening as we go over the different canons for Jews and Christians. And then we'll look at some important history for the Pentateuch, basically Bronze Age history from about 2000 BC to 1177 BC. Important for the emergence of ancient Israel, important for the establishment of the Kingdom of Israel in the 11th century BC, etc. That block of history. And then we will look at the literary flow of the Pentateuch. Now, so let's talk about canon. Let's just give a real simple definition of canon. Canon being C-A-N-O-N. Canon being a kind of an authoritative body of literature. Cultures even have canons, so you can speak of the canon of English literature, for example, or and the like, and what happens even in canons, especially when you talk about ancient Near Eastern lore and religious texts, of which the Hebrew Bible is an example, is that it reaches what's called a canonical form that's then transmitted after it reaches that form. So we'll talk about that a little bit this evening. But first, let's talk a little bit about canon. So we have, like I said, there's Hebrew Bible, then there's the Old Testament, which is very similar in content, but the organization is different. So we have let's just do the Jewish canon first. We have what's called the Tanakh. Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim, or the law, prophets, or writings, or better yet, instruction prophets or writings. So we have Torah, which is Moses, the books of Moses, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, kind of foundational part of the Jewish canon around which the rest of it circles. So the books of Moses are central, especially to rabbinic Judaism. And then we have in the Jewish canon the Nevi'im, or the prophets, which is divided in two pieces. We have the former prophets, Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings. And they only have the latter prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and the 12. And the 12 are what's called the minor prophets in the Christian canon. Hosea through Malachi. With some kind of complex organization, which we'll talk about later. Superficially, it might look like the 12 were organized by from earliest to latest, but that's only apparent superficially. Once we dig into it, we see that the organization of the 12 is a bit more complex. So the Nevi'im or prophets, and then we have the Ketuvim or the writings, Psalms through 2nd Chronicles. A popular way of understanding this, I credit Marvin Sweeney, Jewish Hebrew Bible scholar, for we're talking about this way. In Torah, we have the establishment of Israel. In Nevi'im or prophets, we have the fall of Israel. And with the Ketuvim, we have the reestablishment of Israel. And this gives kind of a clue to what's important for the canon of the Hebrew Bible. We'll especially talk about this when we talk about the literary flow of the Pentateuch. That what the Hebrew Bible, the Jewish canon, values, what's central to it, is the establishment of Israel as a community. It ends at the end of 2nd Chronicles with the decree of Cyrus, allowing not just Jews, but all sorts of people in the Persian Empire to return to their homelands and build their temples. And so the decree of Cyrus, that call to return, that permission to return to the land, is how the Jewish canon ends. Now, when we look at the Christian canon, we have a different, instead of a 3-part division, it's a 4-part division. We have the Pentateuch, which is the same. The historical books, which is contains the former prophets, but then contains some other books that are in the writings as far as the Jewish canon goes, like Ruth, for example, Esther, Ezra, Nehemiah, 1st and 2nd Chronicles. All of those books are in what the in the Jewish canons and the writings. In the Christian canons, those are added to the former prophets to form what's called the historical books. We have, and then in the Christian canon, we have wisdom and poetry, which includes a number of books that are from the writings in the Hebrew Bible. And then we have the prophets: Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lamentations. Now, Lamentations in the Tanakh is with the writings, and then Ezekiel. Daniel is in the writings in the Hebrew Bible, in the Tanakh. It's not considered part of the prophetic books. And then we have 1st and 2nd Chronicles, which is in the writings for the Hebrew Bible. For the Christian canon of the Old Testament, it's in the historical books. So, wisdom and poetry. And then prophets. Prophets, the big difference between the Christian canon of the prophets and the Jewish canon is that the former prophets in the Jewish canon are part of the historical books, and Daniel and Lamentations, which are part of the prophets in the Christian canon, are part of the writings in the Jewish canon. And so the Christian canon ends with this forward looking to the day of the Lord. So we have these, especially Malachi, we have these texts that are important for the early Christian church, dealing with the coming of Jesus. Talking about, so the Lord suddenly coming to his temple is connected in the Gospel of Luke to Jesus being dedicated in the temple. And then we have, at the end of Malachi, we have verses that Christian thought connects with the coming of John the Baptist as the forerunner, and then as the Elijah returned, which is a big deal in Jewish thought, the returning of Elijah, and in Christian thought, that is considered to be John the Baptist. And that's the impetus for that is largely from the book of Malachi. And then we have the day of the Lord. So what the Christian canon is lifting up as most important is eschatology. The coming of Jesus, and then the day of the Lord, in other words, Christ's second coming. So more eschatological focused, whereas the Jewish canon focuses on the establishment of the Jewish community in the land. So some different emphases one thing to note about the Christian canon is that the Christian canon of the Old Testament is not exactly the same in the different Christian traditions. For example, Protestants and other groups coming out of that, out of the Protestant Reformation, have their canon, even though it's in different order, is primarily the same as what you see in the Hebrew Bible. Now, Roman Catholic and Orthodox Christians have the deuterocanonical books. Things like the books of Maccabees, Tobit, Judith, Wisdom of Solomon, etc. So have a more expansive Old Testament canon for Roman Catholics and Orthodox Christians. And the canon is this authoritative body of Scripture that these different communities use, how Paul describes in 2 Timothy 3:16 to 17. So we just turn that. Paul, the early Christian evangelist to the Gentiles who really probably didn't see himself as starting something different. It became different as Christianity really quite quickly grew beyond Judaism, and Paul was definitely part of that. He said, all Scripture is inspired by God and is useful for teaching, for reproof, for correction, for training in righteousness. We have this so that everyone who belongs to God may be proficient, equipped for every good work. So, Scripture is where this, for the various communities that use this, where this comes from. It's hard really to know exactly what the word theopneustos here means, in my opinion, in a lot of detail. It's used here once in the Scriptures, and then it's used in extra biblical Christian literature to describe a host of literature that would be edifying for believers. But chief amongst that is the Scriptures. It was talking to someone earlier today. It's this interpretation of Scripture, interacting with Scripture with attention, is something life-giving for the believing communities. It's something to be attentive to. It's something to be joyous about. It's something life-giving. So with that, let's go ahead and we're going to shift gears a little bit and look at some history related to the Pentateuch. Basically, if we're going to look at ages, it is because we're going to dive into the Pentateuch after I go through this history, this historical frame. Like, if I have my notes here, maybe I'll post some notes on Facebook sometime. Historical time frame for the Pentateuch. 2000 BCE to 1177 BCE. It's the Middle Bronze Age to the Late Bronze Age. So, and some different things to be considered here when dealing with the Pentateuch is that, as far as the events portrayed, is they're meant to be portray an early Exodus or a late Exodus. Does the Exodus from Egypt 15th century BC or 13th century BC? Was Israel in Egypt for a very long time or just a moderately long time? Because the Masoretic text, talked about that a couple days ago, the Rabbinic Bible, 430 years in Egypt. The Septuagint has it 430 years from the time Abram enters Canaan until the Exodus from Egypt. So, different time frames there. As far as Egypt goes, syncing this up with Egyptian history, so most ancient Near Eastern history uses Bronze Age, like Middle Bronze Age, Late Bronze Age. What Egypt uses is, for example, is whether it's early kingdom or middle kingdom, etc., etc. And what we see in Egypt for what's occurring at this time, as we're looking at Middle and Late Bronze Age, in Egyptian terms, its second intermediate period is when Israel enters Egypt and New Kingdom out of Egypt. Second intermediate period, basically Middle Bronze Age, New Kingdom Egypt, Late Bronze Age. So second intermediate period, talking about the Pentateuch, would be the time of the patriarchs. Semitic group rules Egypt, the Hyksos, and not native Egyptians. This is how, I have a little bit of an aside here. This is how Egyptian history is organized. We have pre-dynastic Egypt. First four dynasties, when Upper and Lower Egypt were ruled by different kings, different pharaohs. Then we have early kingdoms when Upper and Lower Egypt was united. Then these intermediate periods are when Egypt is upset, time of societal stress, usually some foreign invaders seize control. So early kingdom comes the first intermediate period, middle kingdom, and then we have second intermediate period, which is when we sync this up with things in Genesis time of the patriarchs, when Israel enters Egypt. What's important to know is it was a time of upheaval where we have this person outside of Egypt came in, the Semitic group, Asiatic, come in and take over Egypt. Then New Kingdom. Why am I harping on Egypt so much? And we'll deal with this more as time goes on. Is because the Egyptian imprint is on Israel so much. Such a huge influence in a lot of different ways that we'll discuss when it's relevant. But there's a reason why most Israelite art that we've discovered is highly Egyptianized, and why early United Kingdom, from what we can see, from what we can find through archaeology, used Egyptian numerals in their accounting. For example, basically had a similar way of organizing their territories as Egyptians did. So very influential. Then after Second Intermediate Period, we have the New Kingdom period. Egyptians regained control. Egyptians gained control of Canaan at this time. They said, that's not going to happen to us again. Before the New Kingdom period, Egypt was pretty isolationist. So this isn't going to happen again. We're not going to let it happen. And so we're going to have more imperial ambitions, let's say. And we're going to go deeper into Africa. We're going to go up into Syria, Palestine, the Levant, and so they gain control of Canaan and fight over with the Hittites between it for a long time, until 1177, which brings to the end of the Bronze Age and brings in the early Iron Age. It was a perfect storm in the Eastern Mediterranean of what basically were Proto-Greeks, the Mycenaeans, coming and conquering and destroying most of the city-states in the Eastern Mediterranean, from Egypt all the way up to Syria. Most city-states were destroyed, the Canaanite city-states, and Egypt was weakened. Not only was there the attack of these, what's called in the Egyptian records of the day, the Sea People. We have evidence of earthquakes. We have evidence in the records of famine. All of these led to the weakening of the Eastern Mediterranean. What happens at this point is Hittites or Hittite Empire is conquered, destroyed, and they survive in a collection of what's called what becomes the Neo-Hittites in Turkey, Syria. So Hittites are destroyed. They don't disappear. Sometimes you read that they disappear. They didn't disappear. They lost their empire, but there's a bunch of different smaller polities that are left behind. What happens to Egypt here is that Egypt has to withdraw and are weakened. So they withdraw back into Egypt. We have the emergence of the third intermediate period during this weakened period of the greater empires on the Eastern Mediterranean, the Hittites and the Egyptians. They are weakened, and this leaves space for an array of different smaller people in the areas being able to establish native kingdoms in a way they wouldn't have been able to. So we see a few different kingdoms emerge. Kingdom of Israel, one of them. We see up in what's now Lebanon, we see Phoenician city-states. And all these things emerge and gather strength when these larger powers are weakened, and they're either destroyed or withdraw and lose their influence over and out of that vacuum we get Israel, which is what we're mostly concerned with, but other things like Moabites, etc., Phoenician city-states, and the like, at the cusp between the Bronze Age and the early Iron Age, which in Egyptian terminology is called the Third Intermediate Period, where the Israelite United Kingdom emerges. With that, I was going to get to the Pentateuch tonight, the Pentateuch proper, and do a kind of a literary look at the literary movement of the Pentateuch. Not going to do that now. I've been talking for 30 minutes, but we'll do that tomorrow. I have work off tomorrow, so sometime in the afternoon I'll jump back on and we'll do that. So with that, God bless. I will see you again tomorrow.